Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this expert webinar and book launch under the title EU-India Relations in 2021, Taking Stock of the Strategic Partnership Before the Porto Summit. My name is Philipp Gieg. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Political Science and Sociology here at the University of Würzburg in Germany. Before we begin, let me inform you that we are recording this webinar. We will make the recording available, presumably next week, and you will be able to find it at the same place that you have registered, that is on the website of the Institute of Political Science and Sociology. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege and great honor now to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Ugo Astuto, the Ambassador of the European Union to India and Bhutan, who will deliver the keynote address. Welcome, Ambassador. And thank you for joining us. Indeed, it is my great honor to welcome more than 130 distinguished guests right now from embassies, delegations, universities, think tanks, political research foundations, governmental institutions, NGOs, from the media, from around the world. So therefore, from Würzburg, I extend a warm welcome to Belgium, the Czech Republic, France, Germany, India, Ireland, the Netherlands, Poland, United Arab Emirates, the United Kingdom, United States, and many other countries. Of course, in these difficult times, while COVID cases are on the rise, again in India, in Germany, let me also express my hope that all of you and your families are healthy and stay safe. I do this on behalf of the co-editors and contributors to our book, EU-India Relations, all of whom you can see on your screen. Right now you are seeing me, but here, these are the people that I've been talking about. I'm very happy that nearly all of the renowned experts who have contributed to our book are here today. I'm delighted to see you again. Axel Nordenstam from the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, Hendrik Chetam Aspencrane from the same institute will join a little bit later, Stefania Benaglia from SEPS in Brussels, Dhanasree Jayaram from Manipal Academy of Higher Education in India, Kirsten Jürgensen from Free University Berlin, Professor Sangeeta Khurana from Bournemouth University will join a little bit later, Nicolas Köhler-Suzuki from International Trade Intelligence in Paris, Patryk Kugiel from the Polish Institute of International Affairs, Siddharth Tripathi from Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Berlin, Professor Pascaline Vinon from the College of Europe at Natolin, and last but not least, of course, Neil Wynn from the University of Leeds in the UK. And finally, let me introduce the co-editors of the book and co-hosts of this event, Chamonix Professor Ummu Salma Bava from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, and Chamonix Professor Gisela Müller-Brandegg-Bouquet from the University of Würzburg, who will both moderate the discussion later in our webinar. And of course, my dear colleagues, Timo Lowinger, Manuel, Pietzko, and Anja Zürn, here from the Institute of Political Science and Sociology at the University of Würzburg. We believe that this is an excellent time to have an event about India-EU relations. First of all, because of the simple fact that the next India-EU summit will take place in a little more than 2 weeks. But beyond that, I'm very interested to hear if some of you are sharing my sentiment that there is a certain momentum in EU-India relations right now. So after years of stasis, it seems to me now that the cautious optimism has gained traction since the summit of last year, and for example, the adoption of the roadmap to 2025. So much is expected from the upcoming summit. And it's not only the economic aspects and the perennial question of when will there be a trade deal. It's also, for example, cooperation in security and maritime affairs that is seemingly destined to become one of the central themes of the summit and of EU-India relations in general, especially after this week's renewed EU commitment to the Indo-Pacific. And these are only two of the issues I think we will certainly discuss in the coming 1.5 to 2 hours. Beyond trade and security policy, we will hear about and discuss climate policy, joint efforts to strengthen multilateralism, connectivity, and much, much more. And I already mentioned our book. Yes, we believe that our book, which has been published last month by Springer, is coming at the right time. My colleague Manuel will tell you more about it in a minute, give you a brief presentation of the book. So the idea for this webinar is combining the launch of our book with discussing the current state of affairs in EU-India relations. After the ambassador's keynote speech, we will hear 3 short perspectives on EU-India relations. Dhanasree Jayaram will talk about climate diplomacy, Nicolas Köhler-Suzuki about trade, and Patryk Kugiel about multilateralism. After that, we will have an open discussion with a broad theme of: will the full potential of the EU-India strategic partnership finally be unleashed, or are the expectations too high? Unfortunately, Gunnar Wiegand, the managing director for Asia and the Pacific at EEAS, cannot be here in person, but Mr. Wiegand has kindly sent us a short video message that we will play later. And I would like to encourage all attendees to either use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We have experienced some problems with that. So if this Q&A option will not work, then just type your questions in chat. My colleague Anja Zürn will monitor these questions, pool them, and bring them into the debate at the end of the webinar. So to conclude, more than 1,200 downloads of our book's ebook edition since last month, and even more so, now more than 170 in total participants in this webinar today, I think are testimony that there's huge renewed interest in EU-India relations. And maybe there is a noticeable and potentially decisive momentum in the strategic partnership too. Excellency, distinguished guests, thank you very much again for joining us today. And now let me hand over to my colleague and co-editor Manuel Pietzko to briefly present the book.
Thank you, Philipp, and hello to all of you from my side as well. The book EU-India Relations, the Strategic Partnership in the Light of the European Union Global Strategy is the result of our workshop In the Light of the EU's Global Strategy, India and the European Union joining forces on the global scene that took place from November 20 to 22 in 2019 in Würzburg. So back then we were able to meet in person and not have to gather via webinar, but maybe that's good, so many people get to know about the book and about the very interesting things all the people were writing in there. The book is also the result of a long-lasting cooperation between Professor Bava and Professor Müller-Brande-Bouquet, who were also both awarded a Jean Monnet Chair by the European Commission in 2017. Thus, in this institutionalized context, the joint research on EU-India relations was a central theme as well. The workshop and the book have been part of the Indo-German Partnership Program in Higher Education, which is financed equally by the German Academic Exchange Service and the Indian University Grants Commission, in which both the Center for European Studies of JNU New Delhi and the Institute of Political Science and Sociology of the University of Würzburg have been working together. Funds have also been provided by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, Professor Müller-Brande-Bouquet's Jean Monnet Chair, as well as the Faculty of Human Sciences of the University of Würzburg. The book scrutinizes the status quo and the future potential of the revitalized EU-India relations. It explores and analyzes conceptual approaches to and key dimensions of the strategic partnership, and it evaluates the prospects for future cooperation. It also offers policy recommendations for advancing the partnership between India and the EU. When we take a look at the different parts of the book, it starts with an introduction picturing the changing world order as a catalyst for a revitalized EU-India partnership, which seems to be true when we have a look on the things going on right now. It then turns to conceptual approaches of EU-India relations, starting from the widespread perception that cooperation between the European Union and India is stuck in a deadlock. My colleagues Timo Lovinger, Anja Zürn, Philipp, Gieg, and I suggest that reconstructing both actors' contestation of norms helps to better understand the problems faced by the EU-India strategic partnership with the help of 2 case studies: civil society involvement and climate justice. Henrik Chetan Aspencreen and Axel Nordenstam analyze what strategies can do for strategic partnerships in EU external relations. They argue that strategies can be a core element for engaging if they manifest both cohesion with the EU's wider understanding of its global role and convergence with the partner's preferences. The next part of the book concentrates on the dimensions of the strategic partnership. Pascaline Buinot examines opportunities and challenges in EU-India relations by taking a close look at the perceptions on EU-India relations, while Sanjita Khurana's chapter provides an up-to-date insight into the bilateral economic relations in the light of the 2018 EU strategy on India. Furthermore, Kirsten Jørgensen analyzes bilateral climate relations between India and the EU, arguing that climate policy offers specific opportunities and incentives for Indian-European cooperation. Finally, Siddharth Tripathi examines India and the European Union's approach to development cooperation, a field which has considerable potential for boosting the strategic partnership and providing fertile ground for an enhanced and innovative institutional framework for our cooperation. Having a look at future cooperation and global potentials, Neil Wynne characterizes both India and the EU as global powers in search of a strategy, and the EU global strategy as effectively relaunching EU foreign policy. The last part is dedicated to policy recommendations. Stefania Benaglia outlines a European perspective of challenges and choices for the EU-India strategic partnership based on an analysis of the global trends to 2030. Patryk Kugiel sees the EU's misperception and low visibility in India as a major irritant standing in the way of a stronger EU-India strategic partnership. While Timo Lovinger describes the EU-India relationship as a playground for policy analysts that influence both policymakers and the public. He proposes the idea of parapublic underpinnings, which could put scientific cooperation on a broader basis, thereby establishing a basis for research on an equal footing of both sides. Our 3 panelists will give some more detailed insights into their findings, with some special attention to the Porto Summits in a few minutes. So I did not forget you. You will have the chance to present your work by yourself in a few seconds. I conclude my remarks with the sincere thanks of the editors to all the authors for their valuable and enriching contributions, which made our workshop such a success, and this volume, of course, only possible. Well, and now I will hand over to Professor Bava, who will, well, go on. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Manuel. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you from New Delhi. As we join from around the world, I think this is a turning point, both in terms of collaboration and partnership, and I will come to that in the end. But I'm extremely happy that we have 2 keynote addresses here today. And while, as Philipp pointed out, Mr. Gunnar Wiegand cannot join us, he will, be joining you through this little video he has sent us. I'd like to introduce Mr. Gunnar Wiegand to all of you. He's the Managing Director for Asia and Pacific in the European External Action Service. With more than 20 years of experience in EU's external relations and trade policy, Gunnar Wiegand has previously served as spokesperson for external relations to Commissioner Chris Patten. He was head of the Unit for Relations with the United States and Canada at the European Commission's External Relations Director General. He was Deputy Managing Director for Europe and Central Asia at EEAS, during which time he was the EU's chief negotiator for the association agreements with Moldova, Georgia, and Armenia, as well as the enhanced partnership and cooperation agreement with Kazakhstan. Wiegand also acted as the EU's chief negotiator for the new EU-Japan Strategic Partnership and Agreement. And I'm sure all of you will agree that to have this kind of a support and statement from the EEAS and the managing director really encourages all of us. With this, I'm now going to be sharing his video message to all of us.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues and friends in India. It's good morning to you all here from Europe. Thank you for this invitation for the book launch and the seminar. Taking stock of the strategic partnership just before the summit is always a good idea. But of course, here it is underpinned by the presentation of a major book. The timing of this book could not be better, not just because of the leaders' meeting, which we have prepared to take place in Porto, but has to take place now virtually, but also because our relations are on an upward slope in many ways and in many areas. This book gives a great introduction to better understand what are the key issues in the relation between the EU and India, and to get the analysis of the different dimensions of this strategic partnership, whether it is on trade and investment, whether it is on climate and environment, whether it is on digital and the greening of our economies, or whether it is on the development cooperation, to name a few of these areas. It examines the status quo and the future potential of EU-India relations, and it evaluates the prospects, which are numerous. I take in particular note that there are quite many concrete policy recommendations on how to further advance this strategic partnership between the two largest spaces of democracy in the world. That goes from peacekeeping and the strengthening of multilateralism to the plurilateral arrangements on issues of common interest, where we would work also with other partners. To name a few areas, connectivity, and we will enter into a connectivity partnership with India in a short moment at the upcoming summit. Whether it is on climate change, where we have to work together to make a real difference in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow and to implement it thereafter, whether it is on stepped up maritime cooperation, whether it is on cybersecurity, counterterrorism, on technology, or indeed climate change. We have in all of this a situation that the seminar will provide concrete insights and to seize the huge, and we have said for too long, the untapped potential for EU-India relations. Let us together work that the seminar will provide concrete insights on how best to do this. Thank you very much, and I wish you the very best proceedings. Bye-bye.
So I think that was a very heartening backdrop with which to start off our discussions here today. And I'm very happy that after that very macro view coming from Brussels, from Mr. Wiegand, I'm very happy that we have Ambassador Ugo Astuto here with us today. This is indeed a befitting moment now to get the view from New Delhi to see that how this partnership is going to move forward. And let me introduce briefly Ambassador Astuto to all of you. He entered the Italian diplomatic service in 1991. His career in the Italian Foreign Service spans experience in the embassies in Nairobi and London, including as alternate director for Italy in the EBRD and in the permanent representation in Brussels and in the embassy of Delhi from 2008 to 2012, where he served as a deputy head of mission. From February 2013 until July 2016, he was seconded to the European External Action Service in Brussels, first as director for South and Southeast Asia, and then as deputy director and director for Asia and the Pacific. From July 2016 to September 2019, he was the principal director for Asia in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Rome. So Ambassador Astuto comes to us from a bifocal view, I think. He was earlier here in India. He went back to Brussels. He's also been in the position where we've just heard from Mr. Wiegand, and he's now back to really, take hold of the situation from New Delhi and lead it forward. With these warm words, may I please welcome Ambassador Astuto and to kindly deliver the keynote. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for this very kind presentation. I'm not sure I recognize myself, but in any case, it's a pleasure to be here with you all, and congratulations to you and to the authors of this book. It's a very timely book, as Gunnar was saying earlier. Just a few weeks before the leaders' meeting. Now, I think we all agree, I mean, you experts in particular agree on the fact that we are living now in a more competitive and interconnected world, which may also appear less stable than it used to be. And we also see clearly the need more than ever before for global cooperation and for a rules-based, to defend the rules-based international order. But against this backdrop, the words to larger space of democracies, as Gunnar said earlier, to say the European Union and India do share the same values and principles and the same belief in multilateralism, the same commitment to rules-based world orders. Therefore, I think the EU and India are well placed to work together as natural partners. As you said, our strategic partnership has gained momentum in the past couple of years, I would say. And at the summit last year, our leaders decided to further strengthen and broaden the scope of the EU-India collaboration. We're working closer to defend multilateralism, to combat climate change, to make our economies greener, to secure our digital future, foster connectivity, and collaborate on political and security-related issues. And all these you find in the roadmap to 2025, which was agreed by our leaders, and to guide joint action over the next 5 years. Now, you all are aware that of the recent Council conclusion on the Indo-Pacific and the announcement of a new strategy. In many ways, the path to the future will be set in the Indo-Pacific region. It's a center of innovation. It's the major source of economic growth worldwide. The EU Council conclusions make it very clear that the EU regards itself as a major stakeholder in the region, and we want to work with like-minded partners, notably India. The aim of the EU strategy for the Indo-Pacific is to contribute to regional stability, to regional prosperity, and sustainable development at a time when we face rising challenges. Free and open maritime routes in full compliance with international law remain crucial, be it for Europe or for India. Grounded on these shared principles, the European Union will further its partnership with India on security and defense. We want to respond together to challenges to maritime security, to explore together how best to address malicious cyber activities and other emerging and disruptive threats. But also counter terrorism, violent extremism, or organized crime. So in a nutshell, we are going to continue to broaden our convergences and work together to contribute to maintain peace and security and defend international law in the region. In a way, as a consequence also our common belief in multilateralism and our shared values, we also want to work together on connectivity. Connectivity is a sort of a buzzword now in Europe and in India. We are preparing also a connectivity partnership with India. We start from the proposition that we have a number of principles that bring us together when it comes to connectivity. At the last summit in July 2020, we agreed on principles such as the promotion of a transparent, inclusive, and rules-based approach to connectivity. We agreed that connectivity must be sustainable and environmentally friendly and fiscally sustainable, providing a level playing field for business. And we also agreed to seek complementarities and cooperation and on connectivity with the country based on these principles. And we recognize the key role of the private sector. India and the European Union are market-based economies. And therefore, the importance to offer incentives also to the private sector for sustainable private financing. So we believe that the European Union and India can be natural partners also in this dimension. It's the development of a shared vision of connectivity in the region and beyond. But the major global priority I would like to highlight here is the fight against climate change. We are today Earth World Day, as you know. So it's a particularly propitious moment to remember that our planet is fragile, that we need to protect its climate, its environment, and to fight against the loss of biodiversity. This requires leadership from all major economies. And at the summit last year, the EU and India reaffirmed the commitment to the implementation of the Paris Agreement and our intention to cooperate for sustainable development. We all see that India has achieved very significant results, for instance, in its energy transition, particularly when it comes to renewables, when it comes to solar. India has been a trendsetter in this respect. But science tells us that the international community as a whole needs to do more. We need to be more ambitious if we want to address the existential issue of climate change. Temperatures are rising. And if you want to achieve the 1.5 degrees objective set in Paris, we need to act now, together and cohesively for the sake of future generations. The European Union is determined to speed up the transition towards a green, climate neutral and digital Europe. And we have set ourselves a target to become carbon neutral by 2050. And very recently, only a few days ago, we have set ourselves new stringent objectives in terms of cuts to emissions by 2030. But the fight against climate change is a global endeavor. So if we want to succeed, we need to work together with our global partners. And India is clearly a key partner in this respect. Together, the European Union and India have the critical mass to influence the global agenda. So we will continue to put climate change and the protection of the environment at the center, at the heart of the EU-India cooperation. And we shall work together to make also to shape a resilient and green recovery from the devastation of the COVID pandemic. We want to cooperate when it comes to setting the policy, but we also cooperate in very practical platforms. We have set up several cooperative partnerships, the EU-India Clean Energy and Climate Partnership, the Water Partnership, the Sustainable Urban Development Partnership. And the European Union is a partner to the International Solar Alliance, a major flagship initiative launched by India. And we recently joined in March the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. So we are determined also to make these cooperative ventures grow and to foster our dialogue on the greening of our economic models. The EU and India need also to work together now in the run-up to Glasgow and to Kunming to make the COP26 and COP15 a success. The green transition is a major priority, but another priority is the digital transition. The green and digital transition, I believe, are twin priorities for both the European Union and India. As open societies and fellow democracies, we can and we should work together to make sure that the digital transition takes place in a secure context, conducive to competition, but also in full respect with individual rights and freedoms. For instance, when it comes to data protection, GDPR is often evoked as a paradigm, as a model, including in India. And India is currently in the process of establishing its own data protection framework. We have now an established and productive dialogue to promote convergence, and the free flow of data is clearly in the interest of both sides. The security of network is another matter of importance, and we must be able to identify those products which could pose a national cybersecurity threat. And in this field too, I think there is space for cooperation between India and the EU. And India, I think, is interested in the toolkits that we have developed in Europe. Moving to the more traditional field of the promotion of trade and investment, the European Union is one of the largest trade partners of India, one of the largest source of investment also. And it's a trade relationship which is pretty even and well balanced. But if you look at the size, if you look at the dimension of our respective markets, clearly we can do more. At the last summit, we established a high-level ministerial dialogue on trade and investment. The Minister Goyal and Executive Vice President Dombrovskis have already met once. They will meet again, I'm sure, and together they will raise the perspective for trade and investment agreements. But they will also discuss the broader economic agenda. There is scope for broader coordination, cooperation on issues such as reform of the WTO, security of supply chains, and regulatory issues. But as we speak now, obviously we are facing a major epidemic, and EU-India cooperation will be paramount also to ensure a global sustainable post-COVID-19 recovery. Italy is holding the G20 presidency now. India will. In 2023, cooperation in the G20 will also be instrumental in setting the pace for a green, resilient, and digital recovery. But right now, the pressing challenge is to overcome the health emergency. We are not yet out of the woods, be it in India, where we see a resurgence of cases, or in Europe, where the situation is also not ideal. So I think that this pandemic is a very definition of a crisis in a globalized world. It has spread rapidly, it knows no border, and it has exposed flaws in the functioning of critical supply chains. And here the EU and India start, I think, from the same proposition, which is to say that the response must be global and must be based on solidarity. This is why the European Union has been a leading voice for the creation of the COVAX facility, which is meant to provide vaccines to all those in need, irrespective of where they live. And the EU and its member states, as you know, are the first contributor to this facility. India is a global pharma hub, and it has a key role in the global response to the epidemic. As a major vaccine manufacturer, it has already started. It has already sent a significant number of vaccines and material to neighbors in need and beyond. And India is also a key player within the COVAX facility. So as the world is fighting COVID-19, I think again India and the EU can find themselves close, and we can together make a difference. We are now preparing for the leaders meeting on the 8th of May. I would conclude simply by saying that I'm pretty sure that the meeting will further strengthen the cooperation between the European Union and India on key areas such as the Indo-Pacific, connectivity, resilience, green growth. We shall use the opportunity to tap further into the enormous potential of the EU-India strategic partnership. A strategic partnership which is deeply grounded into our converging interests, but also deeply held shared values. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Astuto, for those words. I think you've really set us on the track. It's the third decade of the summit starting off. The summits began in 2000. We have an incredible strategic roadmap, 2025 adopted last year, and I think the 16th summit, will take it forward in light of what you've highlighted from the ground up. Protecting a fragile planet in which nobody can take sides. Everybody has to be an equal partner. That for me was the most important point. And of course, it covers a gamut of issues. I once again thank you for these words of support, and now hand over the mic back to Philipp.
Thank you very much, Salma. I now have the pleasure to, one after the other, introduce our three presenters who will present three short perspectives on EU-India relations in 2021. We first thought of asking just every contributor to our book to present, but then we noticed that this webinar would take 4.5 hours. So we just chose to ask three who have been writing on different topics that we thought would be interesting to have perspectives on. These topics are, as I mentioned in the beginning, climate diplomacy, multilateralism, and trade. So first of all, I now have the honor to briefly introduce Dr. Dhanasree Jayaram, who will offer this first perspectives, and she has given us the title of her talk as India-EU Climate Diplomacy, Time to Move Up a Gear. Dr. Jayaram is assistant professor at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education in India. And she has published extensively on climate diplomacy, climate governance, environmental security, sustainable development. Just recently, she has not only contributed the chapter India's Climate Diplomacy Towards the EU to our book, but has also written the book Climate Diplomacy and Emerging Economies, India as a Case Study, which was published just in February by Routledge. Dhanasree, thank you very much. And the screen is yours.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Philipp, for that introduction. And it feels great to be here and to see all the faces after a while, because I remember still the workshop that we had, and we had really great conversations about India-EU strategic partnership. And we also had a lot of conversations about climate change in particular in those conversations. So it was wonderful to have these perspectives heard. And I'm also glad that in the initial remarks made by the ambassador, Professor Salma, and you, again, climate change is something that featured quite prominently. So let me get started with a few points that I would like to share as part of my introduction to India-EU climate diplomacy, and then I will move on to the opportunities for cooperation, which is what is about, the stepping up climate diplomacy now, because I think we have laid the groundwork really well between the two parties, and now is the time to think of much deeper and broader ways to engage on climate cooperation. And it is also a very opportune moment to talk about this, because later today, we also have the Climate Leader Summit happening in the US, where Indian Prime Minister as well as the EU leaders will be present. So again, this means that today is going to be a crucial day in terms of knowing where these big emitters of greenhouse gases stand as far as Paris Agreement is concerned, and also about the fate of the most vulnerable countries. And as we talk about it, of course, India is also one of the most vulnerable countries as far as climate impacts is concerned. And we are in a region, South Asia, where again, we have a lot of countries that are extremely vulnerable. So it's a very important meeting that is going to happen later. A lot of announcements have already been made by leaders. The EU climate law has also been talked about. So there's a lot happening as far as the momentum towards climate action and climate cooperation is concerned. So just to give a brief background to India-EU climate diplomacy and where do the parties stand. And of course, as Ambassador also mentioned, especially since the 2015 Paris Agreement, there has been a lot of cooperation between India and EU. And as you can see from each of the summits, a lot of agreements and a lot of these platforms have been set up to discuss climate change related actions. So, just to give you some idea, there's also India-EU Energy Panel. There is a climate change dialogue platform. Business interactions between the two parties are also on the rise. There is a joint action plan on urbanization challenges, where again climate change features very prominently. There is a lot of talks on how to promote offshore wind, solar energy, rooftop solar. So as you can see, the kind of momentum that we have seen being built up in the past couple of years in particular has been really good. Now what is to be done with this momentum is, I think, the most important conversation here. And here the science comes in as well, because as the ambassador also mentioned, 2 degrees Celsius target may not be enough to save the planet. And so 1.5 is what everybody is now looking at. Now, to get to 1.5, of course, we have a lot of discussions happening about net zero emissions target. And I think here is where India and EU are kind of again on the opposite sides as far as, especially about India's own net zero emissions target is concerned. Now, there are a lot of debates happening within India about it. It is a divided house as of now, because you have a lot of politicians, you have a lot of experts who feel that net zero is going to be the way forward for India. And this is the time to go ahead with a long-term target for India if we have to make use of this opportunity to transform our economy towards a low carbon pathway. Now, in that sense, it can create millions of jobs, as Jen Sinha, one of the BJP members, the ruling party member, very clearly said this can create millions of jobs. This will essentially mean that we won't get locked into this kind of, the carbon pathways which other countries have followed in the past. Let's move away from it. So it may be like an opportune moment right now to go ahead with this net zero target in a more legally binding manner. While others say this is not the time to talk about it because India still has development priorities that we have to look after. We cannot get locked into the low carbon pathway, which will essentially may mean also that our development priorities are compromised. So there is also the other side of the debate, wherein, of course, India's per capita emissions, the whole ethical principles of equity and climate justice, all these issues are also brought up by many constituents of the Indian decision-making community. So in that sense, right now, the net zero emissions is probably the most discussed concept. According to me, at least in my personal opinion, what India is looking at is also what are the short and medium term targets that the other countries, particularly in the industrialized world, are going to come up with. And that's very important. So yes, everybody's talking about 2050, 2060 is what China has announced as its target for achieving the net zero emissions target. So in that sense, what are we going to do about the immediate measures that have to be put in place as well? And here is where India has already talked about broadening its renewable energy agenda. It has talked about achieving the 175 gigawatt renewable energy by 2022, and of course upped the target to 450 gigawatts to be achieved by 2030. Now, here is where I feel it is not about, I think Patryk also mentioned in one of his articles recently, that it is not about trying to put pressure on India, international pressure to be put on India to basically raise ambition on climate. And I think the reason why Patryk and I believe that is because I think the mood is already in that sense in favor of climate ambition and raising climate ambition even at the domestic level. So putting pressure is not what India wants. It's more of cooperation on finance and technology that is required at the state. So India has already made it clear to achieve its renewable energy target, it requires almost $500 billion. US dollars, right? So it has also said that, yes, with the initiatives like International Solar Alliance, it requires $1 trillion US dollars. not just within India, but it's also about projects, solar projects being implemented across the world. And this is where the European Union, of course, can play a huge role in terms of cooperating with India, and not just, like I mentioned, to help India achieve the targets. It's also about strategic partnership, which can help other parts of the world also achieve their climate mitigation targets. Right. So, and here again, let me bring in the aspect of coal. It's very interesting because coal again is a mainstay of India's economy and India's electricity production, and it is not going to go away anytime soon. But then again, in the long term, coal is not going to stay, and it is very clear with the kind of problems that the coal sector has faced, particularly during the pandemic. It's very clear that coal is not something that is favored even domestically these days. But there is a problem with the transition here, because this requires a lot of structural, institutional, financial changes to be brought into the system. Now, this means also that there are a lot of states which are dependent on the coal mining sector. What happens to them? How do they, how do you help these states dependent on the coal mining sector to transition? So just transition is another area where India and the European Union can definitely come together to find solutions as to how to help these communities transition into other employment sectors, for instance. Co-benefits, as I have mentioned in the chapter also written for the book, co-benefits is what India has believed in. And this is the area where, for instance, air quality is one major example there. Now, air quality is not just about climate mitigation. It is also a public health issue, for instance. So where development priorities are kept in mind, as well as climate mitigation, can happen side by side. Now, these are the areas where India has always concentrated on in the past 1 decade or so, and will continue to do so, at least in the short term. So apart from the long-term targets, the short and medium-term targets is, like I mentioned earlier, is going to be the focus areas for India. And this is where the EU can definitely jump in a much greater way. Now, the other areas, where are the opportunities, like what I started with, where are the opportunities lying? So apart from energy transition, renewable energy, of course, electric vehicles, transportation sector is another focus area. Now here, once the Tesla has come into the Indian market and the mood is kind of upbeat, right? So another area where the EU can enhance its investments in is, of course, the transportation sector. And here again, the mood, as I mentioned, is clearly towards transition. So it's not about trying to change the minds in India, because the mind is already changed, and it's like already pointing towards the need for putting in transition in a much greater way, right? So it's already in that direction. Urbanization challenges are huge in India. And we have a lot of cities which are facing climate related challenges, and it can be in terms of disasters. It can be about, climate resilient infrastructure. The ambassador also talked about the coalition of disaster resilient infrastructure. Now, this is another major international initiative brought about by something that was launched by India in 2019. Now, this again gives a platform for both India and the EU, not just to cooperate, like I mentioned, bilaterally, but also bring in other players and build a much more strategic kind of partnership with other countries as well. And transitions in the industrial sector is very important here, because there's also the talk about Atmanirbharta, for instance, right? So when India is trying to be self-sufficient and when it's trying to be self-reliant, especially the manufacturing industry, herein energy transition is going to be very important to discuss as well. And last, not the least, is climate resilience, as I already pointed out in my earlier intervention. Okay, I'm not going to go into a lot of things which I have mentioned in the book, and I kind of encourage everyone to read it, so that most of the other things about the previous collaborations which have happened between India and the EU can be looked at. But just to kind of conclude my intervention here, what are the other ways in which collaboration can happen and cooperation can happen between the two countries? Now, one of the things that definitely comes up is climate cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Now that the EU has a clear-cut strategy towards the Indo-Pacific, I feel this is going to be a major point of entry as well, because we have seen Quad, for instance, which includes countries like India, Australia, the US, and Japan, very clearly putting climate change at the forefront of its agenda. It has a working group on climate change now. Where does the EU figure in that, for instance? Can the EU also step in that respect? I mean, there is also talk about, we talked about the supply chains, and the critical mineral value chain, for instance, is also very important to the energy transition that we are talking about. And the excessive dependence on China is something that at least the Quad countries are trying to get out of. So where does the EU stand in that respect? Is there some move towards also diversifying the supply chains and making the supply chain or the mineral value chain as well resilient to any kind of geopolitical and other challenges that we see? And on the ground level, I feel there are issues to be addressed, including, for instance, gender related issues as to, how do you really integrate gender into climate related investments and climate cooperation. Now, this has not been really addressed in the sense in the way it should be, because there is a lot of investments coming in, but there are also allegations of, for instance, whether gender is not represented or not. There is also talks of greenwashing, for instance, where finance, sustainable finance, for instance, has been under the scanner as to whether this is more of an instance of greenwashing or not. So these are also issues that have to be addressed it's not something that has to be done in the long term, but more in the short term, because as we are saying about protecting the planet, and the planet needs uncompromising cooperation between countries and much bigger level of multilateralism between countries. I think this is probably the right time to also talk about justice related issues and other issues which are sometimes subsumed by the larger strategic partnership agenda. So yeah, all right, so I'll stop there, and thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dhanasree. As usual, a very stimulating talk, and I'm really sure that many of the points you raised will feature in the discussion later. But without much further ado, I now have the pleasure to introduce Nicolas Köhler-Suzuki. Nicolas will offer the second perspective on EU-India relations before the 2021 summit. And his talk is under the headline, "The EU-India Bilateral Trade and Investment Agreement, Still Waiting After All Those Years." Nicolas is a trade policy advisor at International Trade Intelligence in Paris, a boutique consultancy on international trade policy. He's also an associated researcher for digital trade at the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris and co-founder of the Trade Policy Exchange in Geneva. He has contributed the chapter "Determinants and Impediments of the EU-India Bilateral Trade and Investment Agreement" to our book. And now I'm really interested if we will have a trade deal in the POT summit. Nicolas, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Philipp. And thank you as well to all the other editors for putting together such an excellent book launch. It really was a great pleasure to work together with you over the last 2 years, and to work also together with all of the contributors at the workshop in Würzburg in 2019. I'm also very happy to see that Ambassador Astuto and so many participants from all over the world are joining us today. So I'm looking forward to a stimulating discussion. But first, I want to give you a better understanding why trade negotiations have taken almost 16 years now, how we should interpret the recent signals that formal talks may resume after the Porto summit. At least some Indian publications tend to interpret it that way. But in any case, I want to give an impression what a constructive way forward could look like. So in my book chapter for this volume, I argued that there have been 3 distinct phases for the negotiations. First, there was a honeymoon phase between the 2005 summit, and this lasted as well through the first 10 rounds of formal negotiations. until about the end of 2010. And during this honeymoon phase, an agreement always seemed somewhat within reach. But the honeymoon was unfortunately followed by a phase of increasing tension. And this eventually led to the suspension of negotiations in 2013. And then in the last couple of years, we have been what I call a limbo phase, where substantial progress has been made in many areas, but we still have structural obstacles that prevent an agreement. And I found it quite interesting that in the contributions we heard earlier from EEAS officials, there was also quite little mentioning of the negotiation of formal trade talks, but we'll come to that in a little bit. Let me first go through the phases one by one. So in 2005, a high-level trade group drew up a report that gave a taste of some of the problems that were later to come. And this report showed that the EU's tariffs were already quite low in most sectors. So India's strongest interests were lower tariffs on textile and leather and easier access for fruit. India, on the other hand, still had very high tariffs at home and would have to remove tariffs on substantially all trade so that the agreement would be compliant with WTO rules. Outside of trade in goods, India could receive additional benefits by obtaining visas for its IT professionals and by recognizing their professional certificates. But these kind of issues fall outside DG trade. So for the EU, it involves complex negotiations between all member states. Now, the high-level trade group also mentioned the possibility of including competition policy, public procurement, and investment. And this is something that India had resisted in multilateral negotiations. So the language in this report was quite weak on this. But the report was the framework for the trade negotiations, which were officially launched in June 2007. And over the next 4 years, 10 rounds of formal negotiations took place. The Indian and EU negotiators exchanged their sensitive lists and they narrowed down the key export interests for both sides. And I want to highlight 4 issues that emerged during this honeymoon phase. First, it took a long time for India to consult with its domestic stakeholders and then decide which products it wanted to exclude from the agreement. Second, the EU was very offensive on public procurement and foreign direct investment, which required domestic political reforms in India. Third, with the Lisbon Treaty, the European Parliament had gotten the power to co-decide on trade agreements, and the Parliament became a much more vocal player to include labor and environmental standards in the agreement, which India has always rejected. And last, the EU had initially demanded strong intellectual property rights that would hinder the production of Indian generic pharmaceuticals. And this was fiercely opposed by Indian manufacturers and by Western NGOs. So a somewhat strange alliance that we saw. Now, after this honeymoon phase, the negotiations entered their most difficult period. By October 2011, it had become clear that the key EU demand for goods was the export of cars, car parts, and whiskey to India. And the Indian negotiators from the Ministry of Commerce indicated that a long phase out of tariffs in these sectors might be possible. But then in 2011, they were clashing internally with the Ministry of Heavy Industries. And the background was that since 2006, India had an industrial policy for the domestic manufacturing of cars. The idea was to attract investments by foreign car manufacturers that wanted to jump a high tariff wall. And many international car manufacturers had set up factories in southern India. And these companies were now also quite vocal because they wanted to protect their investments from competition. So India offered the EU to lower tariffs for cars from 60 to 30%. And they also offered tariff rate quotas for luxury cars from 10 to 15%. But the EU, mostly on the insistence of Germany, didn't accept this offer. Now, another big problem was market access for whiskey. And several Indian states imposed taxes on imports that the Indian central government couldn't remove without their consent. But for the UK, then obviously still a member state of the EU, Scottish whiskey producers are an important political constituency, and the UK government was not willing to budge on this issue. So there was not really any movement there either. And lastly, there was a problem of visas. The EU started to create a blue card program for skilled migration in 2019, but in the UK, there were fierce political debates around migration caps. The UK was by far the most important market for Indian services companies, so this was setting back the negotiations as well. But the straw that broke the camel's back was that India entered election mode in 2013, and there was a lot of public backlash against the negotiations with the EU. The Indian negotiators were not in a position to make any more compromises, and the negotiations were officially suspended in the summer of 2013. After the 2014 elections, it took some time for the new Modi government to decide on its trade agenda, but by the summer of 2015, India was signaling that it was willing to make more concessions on cars and on whiskey. And yet, it was unfortunate timing because exactly then there was another dispute about Indian generic medicines in Europe and problematic data from clinical trials. On top of that, the UK was adding more restrictions on visas. So it took a lot of political will from both sides to address these issues, move beyond them, and create some trusts for negotiations. And it was only in 2016 that bilateral meetings started again. Now, this is what I call the limbo phase, the last period. And a lot of issues that were previously outstanding have been resolved. And there are more concessions on the table. But most importantly is probably that India had implemented a lot of economic reforms for foreign direct investment, public procurement, and so on in the last couple of years. But because of these reforms being unilateral, the EU now actually has less of an incentive to come to a bilateral agreement. And on top of all of that, the UK voted for Brexit also in 2016, and this created a lot of uncertainty in the following years about the market access that any agreement would bring. So in 2021, April, ahead of the Porto summits, what are the prospects for conclusion today? To some extent, the negotiations for this agreement were quite unusual for both India and the EU. For the EU, it was the first negotiation with a big emerging market under the 2006 Global Europe strategy. The EU suddenly emphasized commercial gain for Europe over using trade agreements as a tool for political leverage. So the EU was less willing to compromise trade for other political goals. And India was in a similar situation. It had previously entered trade agreements in Asia with strategic foreign policy goals in mind. This meant that India would be willing to make trade-offs in the endgame of a negotiation and come to an agreement. But with Europe, India's most important foreign policy relationships have been at the nation state level and not at the level of the EU. So the setting was really not ideal to link foreign policy with trade. So what should we expect to happen at the Porto summit then? Well, on the one hand, India implemented domestic reforms, and this has really narrowed down the outstanding issues. After Brexit, some of the EU's difficult market access demands like whiskey and defensive issues like visas for Indian IT professionals are also no longer there. And perhaps most importantly, the strategic nexus between India and the EU that we've been hearing so much about continues to grow. So both sides might be more willing to compromise on the remaining issues. but there are quite a few clouds that darken the horizon. The European Union is now doubling down on the enforcement of environmental labor standards. This is still a red line for India. The Indian government has been willing to quietly implement domestic reforms, but India won't give in to any demands to show it is giving up national sovereignty. Now, how can we find a constructive way to move forward? I think that the EU and India should not wait another 16 years to conclude a trade agreement, but instead aim for low-hanging fruit and put digital issues on a separate track. So the EU and India are natural partners to cooperate on digital trade. We heard that before as well from Ambassador Ugo Astuto. Both are supporters of a data governance model with regulatory safeguards. Both are amongst the world's largest exporters of services that depend on data. And last but not least, both are liberal democracies, at least on paper. So it should be possible for data to flow more freely across borders than it is for authoritarian regimes. And a digital trade agreement would send a strong signal, especially towards the Asia-Pacific region, which has become a laboratory for new digital trade rules that might later on become global standards. So in spite of the diplomatic rhetoric on a trade agreement that we will likely hear in the next weeks, I think it is unlikely that the structural impediments I talked about will disappear in the near term. So if the EU and India are serious about closer economic cooperation, a digital trade agreement may for the moment be the best way forward.
So thank you very, very much, Nicolas. Again, I have the feeling that trade might feature in the discussion as well. I think it's a very important issue. And now I have the great pleasure to introduce our final and third short talk. Patryk Kugiel will ask, can the EU and India save the international liberal order? Patryk is senior analyst at the Polish Institute of International Affairs and a renowned expert on South Asia, international development cooperation, and EU-Asia relations. He has published extensively on these issues, has contributed 2 chapters to our book. First, From Destroyer to Preserver, ? The evolution of India's position towards the liberal international order and its significance for the EU-India strategic partnership. And second, in the policy recommendations part, perception of the EU in India, a Europe house is missing in European public diplomacy. Patryk, thank you very much for being here, and the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Philip. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the wonderful team in Würzburg for inviting me to be part of this project and for giving me the opportunity to talk today. I'm going to share my thoughts on possible cooperation on multilateralism, and as Philip said, I will do this by characterizing India's position towards the international liberal order. With this provocative somehow question, can EU and India save this order? When we started working on this project and contributing, writing a chapter, we had Donald Trump still in Washington, and the liberal international order was under attack from within by its main creator. At the same time, it was before the COVID pandemic, but there were already growing apprehensions about China's role both in Europe and in India. So there was too many European Union and India appeared to be, as the biggest democracies, appeared to be like-minded partners that can jointly work to preserve and defend the liberal order that was in crisis. And this assumption was already reflected in the EU strategy on India in 2018, and in several EU-India joint statements from summits. Also, Prime Minister Modi was repeatedly saying that India is now a leading power willing to protect the rules-based international order and globalization. So at the surface level, there appeared to be a great deal of convergence between the European Union and India when it comes to liberal international order. So what I wanted to do was to dig deeper and to look below the surface of this declaratory convergences and look at the Indian foreign policy, practice of foreign policy, and to examine India's actions and policies towards three selected elements of international liberal order, so-called partial functional orders that constitute the elements of the liberal order. So I selected three cases: international trade regime, international non-proliferation regime, and position towards democracy promotion and human rights. So before I present the findings of my research, I just must do a small caveat that when I am talking about the international order, I do not talk about any order, but the liberal order as defined by John Eikenberry and other liberal internationalists. So they see the liberal order as the system created by the US and its allies after the Second World War. The system, rules-based system enshrined in global institutions, in international law, multilateralism and liberal values, and where the US is a hegemonic power. So when we understand this order in this way, then India used to be outside this liberal order during the Cold War and started integrating with this only after the Cold War ended. Then India liberalized its economy gradually, opened up to international trade and investments, embraced globalization, and moved closer, re-engaged with the West, with Europe and the United States. And at the same time, yet India was often challenging the existing US-led system, was trying and cooperating also with other emerging powers, like, for example, within the BRICS group, to change the existing status quo and to get more say in international relations. Then under the Prime Minister Modi, again, we saw India drifting closer and closer to the political West, and in some views, India was actually seen as the last heir of liberal order. So what were my findings? How India was this assumption confirmed in the analyzed three case studies? I'm not going to give you obviously detailed analysis of India's position on these three international regimes. For that, I naturally recommend you to read the book, but I will just share with you three final observations. First of all, what comes out from my research, I found varying degrees of integration of India with liberal international order, and therefore varying degrees of convergence with the EU position on given areas. So, for example, on the trade regime, India has integrated with the international trade regime, and it's the most integrated in its history. But nevertheless, it still remains a relatively closed economy and protected market, and with some worrying protectionist trends in recent years, and therefore trade regime or position on trade is one of the major obstacles and point of frictions in relations with the European Union, both at the bilateral level, as was described excellently by Nicolas, and at the multilateral level when it comes to the WTO and multilateral trading system. So when it comes to democracy promotion, India generally does not support the liberal notion of democracy promotion in third countries, and therefore it disagrees with the European Union on both methods and goals of democracy promotion. In addition, one can say that India considers itself as a normative power, like the EU does, so it will not be very keen to follow the prescriptions of the EU in this regard. And finally, on the non-proliferation regime, this is a very interesting case study because here India has made a remarkable transformation from the challenger and contestator of the non-proliferation regime to a responsible stakeholder in this regime, and from the pariah nuclear state outside the regime to the recognized de facto nuclear power outside the NPT. So, therefore, this issue ceased to exist as a point of tensions between the European Union and India in recent years. But very important is to note that this change happened not because India adapted to the non-proliferation regime, but the non-proliferation regime adapted to India by giving it a special status and certain exemptions. So what we can learn from these three case studies is that India is willing to defend the existing international system when it has integrated into the given system, when it has its capabilities grows, and when its interests and ambitions are better addressed. So this leads me to my second conclusion, and the answer to the question I posed in the title of my chapter. So, is India a disruptor or preserver of the liberal international order? And my short answer is, it is neither disruptor or preserver, but it is both. It at the same time, it defends the existing system when it suits its interests, and it works to change it when it wants to accommodate it more to its own interests and preferences. So I illustrate the position of India by drawing from Hindu methodology, and then I would present India as a god Harihara, which is half Vishnu and half Shiva. So half destroyer and half preserver of the universe. And this I don't mean that India is a revisionist power. I would rather say that India is a reformist power. So it wants to reform multilateralism, reform the current international system to better reflect the modern contemporary realities and better suits its own position and ambitions. And this actually brings me to my final conclusion and recommend what it means for the European Union. So my understanding is that actually India is still an indispensable partner for the European Union in the current international system, even though it will not necessarily be a like-minded partner for the EU on each and every issue. There are real differences between India and the European Union on a number of questions, and they will not go away easily or just very shortly. At the same time, both support the rules-based international order, even though they might understand differently those rules and certain elements of the liberal international order. So I think there is still a lot of room for cooperation, and there is still a great deal of convergence between India and the European Union on a number of important global challenges, be it combating climate change, as Dhanasree said, fighting terrorism, realization of sustainable development goals, or most importantly, reform of global institutions. So I think that it is in the European interest to have India better integrated into the current system and to give more space and more voice to India within the system. But the question is whether European Union is willing to reform the existing structures that are favorable to itself, to Europe, and whether European Union want to cooperate with India to reform multilateralism and reform the international system and to support India's rise within the system. I think that recent tensions in China-India relations open somehow a window of opportunity for closer strategic engagements between the European Union and China, and it will help to strengthen the convergence of views between the two on a number of international issues. So I will conclude with final word statement that to my understanding, the European Union and India cannot save the international liberal order together, but still they can work together towards a new reformed, still rules-based international order, but it will be something a bit different. So also EU and India can jointly write those rules in ungoverned spaces in the future. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patryk. Thank you again, Nicolas. Thank you again, Dhanasree. I think we have now heard 3 very stimulating, thought-provoking, and interesting short talks. And yet they were only 3 short glimpses into the broad array of chapters in our book and in the depth of the analysis that all the chapters in our book are providing. So again, I'm very happy that all but 2 or 3 of the contributors are actually here now, and all our guests can see the full panel now in front of them. So without much further ado, I hand over to Professor Bava from JNU and Professor Müller-Brandegg-Bouquet from the University of Würzburg to moderate our full panel discussion. And just want to remind all guests, if you have questions, use the Q&A feature or the chat to ask questions.
So thank you very much, Philipp, and thank you very much for all the interventions, very interesting interventions. I mean, they gave so much space to ask questions from our side, Salma and mine. But first of all, maybe we should give the other contributors the possibility to join in the discussion, to ask the first questions, just to launch our discussion time. Philipp, we are a little bit late. How much time do we still have for this discussion? But,
so we have at least 20 minutes. If you take 20 minutes, then we will end on time. But if the discussion would be so great, then we could sure take 5 minutes extra. I don't know.
Thank you. So are there questions or the need of intervention from the side of the other participants to this workshop and also book contributors? Not yet. So may I ask a question to all the 3? We heard a lot about the expectations with regard to climate change. And my question would be, do you think that the European Union is capable of giving answers, responding to all these questions, these expectations from the Indian side? This would be my question to Dhanasree. And then Patryk and Nicolas, did I understand well what you said? Nicolas, you said that there are a lot of obstacles and deadlocks in the negotiations between both partners in order to come to an agreement. And now you propose to change the main topics and just to not talk about agricultural issues anymore, but just to go over and to try to go for a digital agreement and to forget the other issues where we talked about for 16 years without achieving. This would be my question. And this would change the topics of the cooperation from what we discussed in the last decades to climate change and digital. And this reminds me of the European Green Deal, which exactly focuses on these two things. That would be interesting for me. And for Patryk, I agree completely with you that it is not the question to save the status quo, multilateral order, international order, liberal order, but to reform it. And even if we, as you said in your last sentence, you agree with me that it's to reform it, I still do not see real fields where India and the European Union would agree. For example, will they really work together in changing the Security Council with the over-representation of the European Union after Brexit? This issue is still more complicated than before. So what ideas would you have for the Europeans how to launch this reform process?
So let me join my colleague Gisela in also putting a question, but now I don't focus to the three presenters, but I want to draw all the others in with just a simple statement. We went into a workshop in 2019, December, where the world was still in order. The pandemic was breaking, it had not made headlines. It was still a footnote. We are now here with a book which is actually prefaced with a backdrop in which the pandemic makes a headline, and we are in a fear of becoming a footnote in history. If you don't realize that we have actually, in current times, experienced the biggest disruption of our life. And this cuts across generations, it cuts across countries, it has, in a globalized and interdependent world, we see the domino effect happening in such a swift manner that everybody is left to pick up the pieces. So if there was one thing in terms of, that you would want to revisit and put forward as we look at Porto at the summit happening with a sense of urgency, what would be that one thing that you would flag for us today? Because I think it cannot be business as usual. Technology was pointed out to be the biggest disruptor. Today, it is the very ethos of cooperation. How do we look at saving humanity, which has come to the front, right? It cannot be business as usual. So what is the first thought which comes to your mind for the other book contributors that you would want to flag here for this afternoon's discussion? Thank you so much. So who would like to go first from the others who have not spoken till yet? Pascaline, can we ask you?
Yes, okay. Thank you. It struck me when I was listening to the presentation of the ambassador that development cooperation was not mentioned once. And I was wondering, if Siddharth would have something to say about this. What does he think about it? Just to spark the debate a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for bringing together everyone again virtually, unfortunately, but well, that's how it works. I was also quite surprised what you said, that there wasn't mention of development cooperation when, I mean, there is a huge discussion that is going on health diplomacy. and health was, and amidst all this crisis, and China is taking a lead on health diplomacy, I guess that's one of the areas that needs to be really flagged, especially in the current times. Thank you.
Sorry, Stefania?
Thank you. Yes, if I may react to this very stimulating question with one word answer, which is unsurprisingly one of the 3 expected deliverables of the summit, is connectivity. Why do I say connectivity? Because connectivity provides the framework and the tools for better responding to whatever will come. So connectivity not as the answer, but as the enabler that will enable swifter answer to the challenge that we have in front of us. Because only by connecting all the dots and indeed realizing that we are not working in silos, which is still a way that the way we are approaching foreign policy and our domestic policies, but only by bringing coherency in all our actions, we're actually going to be able to reply more swiftly to whatever we are facing in front of us. And I hope that what we've seen is the worst, and the worst is behind us. And as you say, we still have to see a lot in front of us. And this resolution, I'm afraid, is quite far away from us. But there is a lot of connectivity discussion, of course. We're expecting a connectivity partnership to be adopted. Asia is doing a lot on connectivity. Europe knows a lot about connectivity, but the whole concept of connectivity in foreign policy is kind of a newity in the concept of EU foreign policy. So I think that that really holds the key of how to structurally frame our discussion in a way that we can be much more efficient tomorrow to face whatever it will be in front of us.
Could I ask Henrik, Axel, and Kirsten also to please come in?
Yeah, I can go first. Thank you so much for this great conversation and also for putting this anthology together. I think the question about flexibility in conducting international relations at a time where we see a shift towards a more multipolar world, and also in terms of the new kind of web of strategic partnerships that is growing, new forms of minilaterals, new forms of doing multilateral relations. I think that kind of agility to navigate for a big institutional organization like the EU and India with its a bit less of capacity in the foreign service and institutional capacity. I think to match those things in this new landscape that is evolving is a big thing that we need to follow closely in years ahead.
Okay, Axel?
Yes, thanks a lot for this thought-provoking question, and also for gathering us once again. My quick answer is to think about this as team, to think about the European side as Team Europe. That is actually not only about Brussels or the larger member states, but it's also about small and medium-sized member states. So when we're thinking about the future of EU-India relations, then we should think about the smaller and medium-sized member states and the large one on the European side, and also take a broader perspective on the Indian side. Not only think about Delhi, but also in state capitals and cities. Thanks.
Okay. Kirsten, and then Sangeeta, you would maybe want to put your question? Kirsten?
Hello, very nice to speak here. I don't have any idea which would really, where I could say, yeah, that could fly, frankly speaking. But what I still think is that there is a huge potential in collaborating on low carbon development as well as climate adaptation. This is, I think, not a question at all. And I think that strengthening multi-level governance structures, bringing in as many levels as possible on the ground and at the subnational level and the civil society, would be a very promising perspective in improving transition towards low carbon development. Thank you. It was very nice to see you all.
Sangeeta?
Hi. My question, hi. So my question is about human rights, because there's a lot of discussion that is ongoing, and that seems to be actually going very high on the priority as I can see. So my question was, how can provisions to guarantee human rights be implemented and enforced as part of any future EU-India partnership? Thank you.
Thank you, Sangeeta. Gisela, should we go back to your questions to our three presenters and have a quick feedback comment, because we have questions in the Q&A.
I would be pleased, yes, if the three of them could just try to pick up my questions. Thank you. If we have the time, I would.
Yeah, I think we can.
Yeah, okay.
So should we start in the reverse order? Patryk first.
Yeah. Thank you very much. First, short comment on COVID-19 as a major disruptor. I would rather prefer to look at it as an opportunity for India-EU cooperation. And I think specifically about the relocation of global supply chains. So it opens up an opportunity for India to attract more manufacturing and more investments that would be maybe more afraid to stay over in China and in other places. So it opens a big opportunity for trade and investments between two sides, but provided only that India will improve the protection and conditions for foreign investors in countries. So this means that we will most of all need to speed up on negotiations of the investment agreement between European Union and India. And I would rather expect some announcement in this regard at the forthcoming summit, so on investments. And regarding the how to move the process of reform of multilateralism forward, first of all, I think that the ball is in the EU court. So for me, this is really understandable why the EU cannot come out with a joint position supporting India's bid to the Security Council. You know, European Union is the only next only to China among the major powers that did not officially, publicly supported India's aspiration to become a member of the UN Security Council. So this is probably not the very best company from the Indian point of view. So EU must do some homework regarding what it wants from the UN and UN Security Council. That's first point. Second, we have already some attempts to reinvigorate cooperation on multilateralism. And I think about the alliance of multilateralism that was established by France and Germany and some other countries, including India. So maybe they can work out some solutions and proposals within this group. And thirdly, I think the low-hanging fruits are to work together, European Union and India, to make new regulations and new norms and standards in ungoverned spaces. So let's talk about connectivity, digital sphere, maritime security, artificial intelligence. So these are all areas where India and European Union, as biggest democracies and liberal states, can come forward and present some new ideas, new institutions, new regulations that will make the world more stable and secure.
Nicolas? So trade is back on the agenda. There's a high-level official ministerial, a Sherpa group, so to speak. How optimistic?
Well, I mean, as I was saying in my presentation, I'm not too optimistic in spite of all the diplomatic stirrings that are obviously happening around such a summit. If you go back in time, as I did.
Philip, have we lost?
Yeah, I think, Nicolas, you are lagging a little bit. Maybe Dhanasree can jump in.
I think
if he's back, he can return.
We come to you. A Green Deal partnership, would that sweeten the deal for both sides? It's not just a Green Deal for Europe, but we need a Green Deal for a fragile planet. That's what the ambassador said. Nicolas, we just come back to you. We've lost you.
Can I answer? Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, Dhanasree.
Yeah. So I'm just going to combine a lot of things together. So what Gisela asked, what you asked, and I also see this question in the Q&A as well. So I'm just going to combine everything and about expectations from India and what can the EU do? Is EU ready? And that is a question I think which we all need to ask. Because I think India has made its stance very clear that India, as I mentioned, it is on that road towards transition. And it is very clear that there is no going back from the energy transition roadmap that India has already sort of built, or, the foundations that it has laid. Now it is up to the EU now to tell us as to what are the financial and technological sort of assistance that the EU can give in terms of reaching India's, and also, like I mentioned, the entire developing world's targets, because that is where I think India also has that special position, because it can influence the positions of various other developing countries as well in terms of the climate change negotiations itself. So which is why I kind of, look at both the bilateral agenda, where of course the Green Deal that we are talking about, and COVID-19 is of course the elephant in the room. And we have forgotten that in this 1 year, so much of disruption has happened. It has also, in fact, put a brake to a lot of renewable energy projects that India was supposed to build in the past 1 year, right? So now this is where a lot of assistance will be required. And this is where the multilateral agenda has to work somehow or the other. And I think the US is also kind of realizing that. And when John Kerry visited India recently, and this was, usually you would always think that, okay, now there's going to be pressure on India to adopt the net zero emissions target. But in fact, he focused more on understanding what are India's requirements on the other hand. And it was very clear. He also mentioned in one of his public appearances that I'm not here to pressurize India into adopting such a target as such. I'm trying to also promise investments in sectors like, for instance, green hydrogen. So this is where I think, although India has just come up with a roadmap for joint collaborations on green hydrogen, so technological partnerships where India and US have come up with such a partnership. India and EU have also started talking about collaborating on green hydrogen, because this is going to be crucial for India to achieve its targets once again. And this is the path on which India has just embarked upon. So there's a lot to be done on that front. So finance, technology, on that front, I think it is up to the EU now to decide as to how really to build these partnerships, to find where the investments can go in and how really to make these investments work at the ground level. I think knowledge and research, like I mentioned, is also very crucial areas. And this is where already a lot of partnership has been built. And as we talk about roadmaps to net zero, already a lot of studies are happening. And this is another area where the EU, for instance, can talk about what are the policies being adopted by some of the countries within your EU, like Germany, Poland. What are the kind of just transition policies that have been implemented there to make sure that the phase out of coal is done in an effective manner, right? So like I mentioned, coal is not going to go away very soon from the Indian energy sector, not really, but then like I mentioned, transition is something on its way happening, right? So then in that sense, what can the EU countries, in terms of knowledge sharing, what can they share? with India is also going to be one area which I think a lot of, wherein EU can definitely step in much more. And about.
So we've lost Dhanasree. That's the challenge of that. Nicolas is back, and I see Neil has not come in at all, and I've not forgotten you. Gisela is also keeping track. Nicolas, would you like to finish off your point on the trade thing? I mean, you said no optimism, but what's the way forward? Break up the agenda?
Hi, I'm not sorry what happened.
Okay, that's a horror movie going on over here. I think we'll have to wait on Nicolas to join a little later. Neil, will you please come in?
Yeah, I think from my point of view, the key things are the strategy, the renewal of the EU global strategy, which will happen in due course, and the relationship with India vis-a-vis that renewal of that strategy. I think that's very important. And I also think it's very important in terms of what the member states want to do. And there you do have key differences between large states, small states, more liberalizing states versus more protectionist states. I think those are the key issues. And then the issues of connectivity and I guess, in terms of climate change as well, what role does the EU want to take in that process? And how can we have a better relationship on development of alternative technologies, on renewables and things like that, technology transfer, that kind of thing. So I think those are the key things that really matter in this relationship right now.
Yeah, so thank you, Neil. I think we have a problem of connectivity with Nicolas, though Stefania pointed out connectivity is going to be a key. We'll have to get over these technology difficulties. I want to bring in two of our other, book writers over here who've been rather silent. That's Timo and Anya. Anya's manning the room in terms of the questions. I'd like you to tease your way from there, Anya, and come in a little bit on what are your critical reflections at this point.
All right, thank you. We received a lot of, good. We received different questions, and unfortunately I have the difficulty to take some of them. I think one of them is very interesting concerning what Ambassador Ugo mentioned about the GDPR, as one asked whether GDPR in this context, Europe and India is taking unprecedented steps on technology governance and concerning digital markets, and asking what kind of cooperation and at what level India-EU engagement is taking place in this theme. I think that's very interesting to ask.
Okay, Timo? Timo, you're muted.
I think we do have also other questions.
Yeah, I know I saw that, but I thought just that one quick round before we get into the last thing, because I think all the contributors have given one contribution. So we have three sets of questions as I look at here. There is one concern on human rights. I think, and then Timo can come in after that. One question on human rights about how will that figure in the part of this bilateral, partnership? How does it go forward? There's a question on the proposed carbon tax, on the carbon border adjustment. What does that mean? I can really push that and say, would that be considered as a non-tariff barrier? That would be important because you're creating new conditionalities where we have not yet negotiated the old. And then there is a question on investment, on how would that, would EU look at, and the countries within the European Union look at investing in India under the Made in India program. So one could, club all of that and also ask that Patryk said that the pandemic is an opportunity. I would see that he's an optimist. But if you were to really see that there is a real cutback everywhere, and I think the recovery in terms of what was anticipated has also pulled back. Gisela, please come in on this as we go in for a final round, and then people can answer in terms of your own questions and points you would want to put over here.
Could we just give to Nicolas, who is back again, the chance to finish his second intervention? He had a lot of problems. I propose that we do this first.
Yes, good. Nicolas.
Hi, I'm really sorry. I don't know why my connection keeps dropping out. So I did not catch all the questions that might have come in between, but just to answer Gisela's initial question, do I think that we should just leave the negotiations that have been with us for so many years now behind and focus on another topic? No, of course, I'm not saying that. Negotiations should continue. But that being said, as I think I have presented to you, there is reason to think that we're not going to have results anytime soon. It probably won't take another 16 years, but who knows? I mean, if there's no movement on structural issues, if the European Union now has a strict trade enforcement agenda, meaning that the European Union wants to project its rights, including human rights and sustainable development standards, climate, through its trade agreements, I see that there is not really any space to come to an agreement, because India will not accept this. And I don't think anything has changed on this. This has been a consistent position over the last 2 decades. So there is fundamental incompatibility here, right? And the foreign policy goals that have been integrated into some of India's trade agreements work with other partners, but it doesn't work with the European Union insisting on these standards. Now, India recently proposed, as part of the high-level trade group that was very publicly announced, that why don't the two sides go ahead and have an early harvest scheme, something that India had in earlier trade agreements. But the problem with that is that it's fundamentally not compatible with WTO rules. So under WTO rules, to have a trade agreement that is compatible with WTO membership, you need to show that the agreement frees substantially all trade. And these early harvest schemes would have to show that it's really just the first part of a longer process. And the EU, as a self-labeled defender of the multilateral trading system, and by the way, India as well, should tread very carefully. And I don't think for that reason the EU will also accept such an early harvest scheme. So I was only saying, if it seems so unlikely that there's going to be any movement in the trade agenda, why don't we see whether there are some issues where there is convergence? There has been convergence for a couple of years, where it's very important to now act together to set new global standards. Because in the digital trade realm, the EU interest and India's interest are much more similar with the regulatory safeguards model than, for example, the set of interests that the United States has and the set of interests that digital authoritarian regimes like Russia and China have. So you can go ahead now and send a strong signal in the Asia Pacific, and it very nicely integrates with the diplomatic rhetoric of the two liberal democracies working together to set these standards and have some movement in the economic relationship. It doesn't mean the trade negotiation should stop, but as I said, 16 years in the making. We don't want to wait another 16 years, because at that point the train will have left the station on digital trade standards, and everybody else will have already concluded something. That's it.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. You have helped us to safeguard a little bit the optimism the ambassador introduced at the beginning, and that you all lowered down during our discussion. I mean, at least is my understanding of our discussion. Should we go back to Anya and introduce some more questions from the public? From the
Anya?
round?
How much do we spill over? We are almost at the very end.
Yeah. One more, maybe?
So I think we could add one question. Is that all right? Right.
Yes.
It comes from Simon Hockenberger. He asked whether the DG, the Director General for Trade, believe in India, or what you do think, whether they believe in India and understand the growing opportunities of companies, for example, and he therefore asked, does India finally see the proposed EU-India investment agreement as the best contribution to the Make in India program?
Nicolas?
Yes, sure. I mean, does DG Trade believe in this? Of course. I mean, they've been trying to push for an agreement since the Global Europe strategy in 2006, which recognized that there are, I mean, at that point, they were emerging markets. At this point, clearly, India has emerged as one of the largest economies. We have to remember that the bilateral economic relations have grown manifold over the last 2 decades in spite of the existence of this agreement. So there are ways to cooperate economically, to give room for regulatory cooperation, to have the backing, the political backing from the highest levels that don't necessarily need to involve a formal agreement. So maybe that is a way forward when there's a growing strategic nexus that you can say, okay, we're not going to be able to move forward with a formal trade agreement, but look, our economic relations really have dramatically grown. So let's see what we can do outside of the formal arrangements. And of course, DG Trade recognizes it, has been recognizing it for many years. And so does the Indian side.
Should I just add to that, if you've seen the spate of visits or virtual summits which have taken place, trade literally has been there on every bilateral agenda, recently. So I think what you're also seeing is, one is the collective European dimension, which Nicolas pointed about DG Trade, but it also has to be broken down in terms of the bilateral, where member states are actually, implementing bits and pieces of it. So there is an opportunity at this point, a win-win for this Make in India project as it has been launched. But it also then, as you said, both sides have to come forward, have to traverse the road, and it would be industry-wise different. It cannot be a 50-50 in everything. Something may be a 60-40, 70-30. But I think if there is a willingness to do business, I'm sure that both sides would find it. This is some of my observations, looking at what has happened in the last at least 6 to 8 months, the high-level summits which have taken place. Anya, is there any other question that we can quickly pose, or Gisela?
I think Patryk and Dhanasree want to say something, and maybe we then should end the seminar because people are leaving. We all, I think, too have to leave soon. So please, Dhanasree and Patryk, so you just make your remarks and then we should end.
Sorry, yeah, sorry, I just got logged out. Somehow there were some connectivity issues here. I'm sorry for that. And in fact, I just wanted to answer one of the questions, which I think I started and then I got logged out of the meeting, about the carbon border adjustment program. And I think this is where there are differences between the EU and India for sure. And India has already said that this goes against the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which is one of the principles that India will not compromise upon as far as climate policy is concerned. So this is obviously going to affect a lot of sectors in India, including steel, for instance, right? So this is where India definitely sees it as a unilateral measure. And again, there has to be that conversation. There has to be that agreement between the two parties as to how really to reach that consensus on, avoiding these kind of unilateral measures, which will affect developing countries which are still on that development path, right? So that is definitely one area. I just wanted to mention one more area where there will be divergences as far as climate change is concerned, and that is on security and climate. And it's very important because I see that there is a lot of push from the European Union, particularly from some countries within European Union, including Germany and France, for instance, some of the Nordic countries, which have pushed that security agenda a lot. And this is where India, for instance, has been on the defensive and does not want to include security agenda as far as climate action is concerned. So these are some of like the no-go areas as far as climate policy is concerned for India. And for European Union, these are, especially the security agenda I see has picked up a lot of momentum in the past few years, and there is a lot of talks going on, but this is not going to be easy for the Indian side to really accept. So yeah, that's all.
So Patryk, please.
Thank you. I would like to respond to the question concerning the human rights situation in Kashmir and elsewhere, and enforcement of this in any trade deal. So I think the inclusion of the human rights clauses into the trade agreement was one of the reasons why the negotiations stalled. So it is a point of friction, it used to be, but it is nevertheless the normal policy of the European Union to include human rights clauses in its economic deals with third countries. And it will be the same regarding India. This is also, expected from the European Parliament to pay attention to the human rights situation. So when the deal needs to be ratified at the European Parliament, then you can expect European parliamentarians will expect the deal has human rights clauses. And also, if you look at the recently concluded negotiations of the investment agreement between the EU and China, surprisingly enough, there was also clauses on human rights, labor rights, and etc. So in this context, the EU will expect to have these clauses in any prospective deal with India. And I think we also observe some movement on this front, also on the Indian side. We just seen the resumption of human rights dialogue this month after 7 years break, I think. So the Indian position is also shifting on this. So I think that can open a way for negotiations of the trade deal. And to be frank, I think India has nothing to be afraid if it agrees to some certain human rights commitments in the trade deal or investment deal, because of the problems of enforcement of that kind of deals. If you look at the EU economic agreements with partners in Africa, very rarely there is any sanction or action taken by the European side if the human rights situation is violated in a given country. So it would be good for India to agree to certain clauses in the deal, and then we will see how the implementation and enforcement will be the issue in the future. And with this, I would like to thank all of you and for this seminar. Thank you very much.
And I think these are excellent closing remarks. But before closing, really, Salma, do you want to add something, or should we hand back to Philipp? Or yes. How will we?
Philipp?
I would say that, Salma, that you offer the concluding remarks, and I would have nothing to add besides, again, thanking all of you for giving me at least the feeling of a 2019 reunion when times were better, and thanking all of the guests that were joining us here. So, Salma, you finish the event.
Thank you so much. So I hold up for everybody. This project would not have been possible, but for many, many hands which came together. And I think it's befitting to have a vote of thanks here. And I would like to start by thanking the EEAS in Brussels and the EU delegation in Delhi for the support and in pulling out all the stops to see that we have had such a high visibility event today. I think a big thank you to Mr. Gunnar Wiegand and his office that despite the inability to be here today, for recording the video message and giving us a macro view of the partnership. I would also like to thank Ambassador Ustuto for his encouragement and giving a view from Delhi for agenda setting for the next summit, the way ahead. That's extremely important. I also want to place on record my personal thanks and on behalf of all the co-editors to Mr. Christoph Manet, who's the head of the political section in the EU delegation in New Delhi, and to Andrea Kofod-Scheutz for getting this act together for us. I think without all that backdoor work, it would not have happened. Friends, a genuine partnership is built on time and trust as the two pillars of academic collaboration. And I want to acknowledge Team Würzburg, led by Professor Gisela Müller-Brandeck-Bouquet, Philipp, Timo, Manuel, and Anya. For those who don't know, it's 9 years of partnership, which has been strengthened by two very big projects, the University Grants Commission and DAAD IGP project, and the Jean Monnet Chair, which has led to the joint cooperation leading to this book. I would like to thank all the book contributors and finally to the audience for their interest in joining us today for this outstanding launch of the book. We would be available to do smaller format events with those who are interested on taking forward these conversations. With these words, once again, I'm very happy to be with all of you here today in the virtual space. Optimism is what is driving all of us, and hopefully the coming months bring us another opportunity in which we can again engage and collaborate, most probably maybe a review after the summit takes place. So thank you so much, and Philipp, over to you.
Thank you very much. I have nothing to add, but say thank you and goodbye. Have a good day. See you.